How would you describe the Gulf of Mexico?
Paradise.
Subtropical paradise.
Paradise.
Grand Isle was paradise.
It's a sportsman's paradise.
Diverse, abundant.
Strong.
Resilient.
Bountiful.
Beautiful.
Magnificent.
Perfection.
Home.
I think that we are facing a situation where there is relatively little oil, where there is not enough to warrant the substantial risk, where you've got...
Nobody knows how many millions of barrels, billions of barrels of oil, and how many trillions of...
Our industries have pioneered the technologies used in environmentally responsible drilling.
Branch,
they were not prepared to take the risk. We are not prepared to take the risk that the Secretary of Interior is very focused on.
And we'll drill for the billions of barrels of oil that we have right now warehoused underground, including our resources offshore. We will drill here.
Drill, baby, drill, and drill now.
So today we're announcing the expansion of offshore oil and gas exploration, but in ways that balance the need to harness.
Drill, baby, drill. Drill, baby, drill.
11 workers are still missing and feared dead, while the rig that exploded on Tuesday has now sunk, threatening a major oil spill off the Louisiana coast.
We are at the beginning of the end, but there are still a lot of uncertainties.
On the morning of April 20th, 2010, there was a disaster aboard the Deepwater Horizon drilling rig, which killed 11 people and leaked massive amounts of oil into the Gulf of Mexico. The Gulf, which is the lifeblood for so many hard-working Americans, had become severely damaged and polluted. What caused this tragedy? Who was ultimately responsible? And how long was it going to take for this once bountiful ecosystem to bounce back from this severe devastation? To find the answers to these difficult questions, we will need to begin this investigation by taking a closer look into BP's history.
I believe that the fundamentals of BP, our strategy, our assets, and the high standards of our people are something we should all be proud of.
In 1995, BP hired mergers and acquisitions guru John Brown as its new CEO. Brown had one mission: to make BP the largest oil conglomerate possible at any cost. 2 years later, he initiated what was then the largest merger in history, a $61 billion takeover of Amoco, Arco, Burma Castrol, and several other companies, making BP the third largest private oil company in the world. It was these mergers that caused BP to face the enormous task of upgrading numerous aging facilities, managing substantial debt, along with integrating thousands of new employees. You might then be asking yourself how this affected BP's safety culture. Not well. In fact, the EPA cited BP as the largest polluter in the United States. This was even more evident when studying their long history of disasters. The list is shocking.
since you took over as CEO of BP, that safe, reliable operations are number one priority, correct?
That is correct.
And you've been CEO for the past 3 years, correct?
Correct.
Then explain to us why, between June of 2007 and February of 2010, the Occupational Health and Safety Administration checked 55 oil refineries operating in the U.S. 2 of those 55 are owned by BP, and BP's refineries racked up 760 citations for egregiously willful safety violations, accounting for 97% of the worst and most serious violations that OSHA monitors in the workplace. That doesn't sound like a culture of safety.
In summary, in the United States alone, from 1990 to 2010, BP was responsible for 8,000 spills, 217 injuries, and the deaths of 38 of its own employees. BP has also been charged with numerous felonies and has become infamous for cutting corners in order to increase shareholder profits by any means necessary. After learning of all BP's willful safety violations, deaths, injuries, environmental disasters, and felony charges, it was astonishing to learn of the billions in U.S. government contracts they were still receiving. Why was the United States government continuing to fund this blatantly egregious behavior? To answer this, we must look further into the past, when the need for domestic oil production became much more prevalent within the United States government.
Good evening. The Middle East War produced developments all over the world today. The oil-producing countries of the Arab world decided to use their oil as a political weapon. They will reduce oil production by 5% a month until the Israelis withdraw from occupied territories. If the Arab countries keep that pledge, it would reduce their production by almost 50% in 1 year.
As a result of U.S. support of Israel in the Yom Kippur War, in 1973, OPEC announced that it would cut production and place an embargo on the export of crude to Western countries. This caused a global spike in oil prices, unlike anything the world had ever seen. After the embargo, consumers were forced to wait in long lines at the pump. Station owners set limits on the amount customers could buy and frequently ran out of gas, regardless of the fact that America imported less than 50% of its oil from Arab nations. During this time, oil prices increased 330%. Big Oil used the embargo as political motivation to open new lands for domestic drilling. However, this increase in domestic production would not bring any real relief at the pumps, as the oil companies decided to keep crude prices high to maximize profits. This had a devastating impact on economies across the globe. The U.S. responded by creating a new energy policy and began to look into alternative energy solutions. But sadly, by the end of the 1970s, the lessons of the oil embargo were all but forgotten, and Americans had reverted back to their previous consumption habits. Ultimately, the embargo changed the way the United States viewed its dependence on foreign oil, forcing the nation to take a serious look into drilling in its own backyard.
Reagan is our projected winner. Ronald Wilson Reagan of California, a sports announcer, a film actor, a governor of California, is our projected winner.
Ronald Reagan was elected president in 1981. He made the initial push to open domestic drilling, allowing free markets to reign and trusting that big industry would act morally. Under Reagan, the Federal Trade Commission took on a new, dismissive approach toward corporate mergers. This environment fostered the biggest takeovers in corporate history: Exxon and Mobil, Chevron and Texaco, Conoco and Phillips, and BP with Amoco and then Arco. creating the largest corporations in the history of the world. The mergers allowed big oil to resurface as a major owner of oil and allowed them to exercise their control over prices through the futures market, replacing OPEC as the principal determinant of the price of crude.
Ronald Reagan made promises that we're going to deregulate everything, we're going to get government out of your life entirely, and that private industry is going to do a better job, and we're all going to be happy with private industry. Private industry is going to be able to deliver the mail better, they're going to be able to give you health care, they're going to be able to take care of your children, they're going to be able to take care of prisons, they're going to take care of everything for you. It was the biggest lie that has ever been told to the American public.
I am suggesting that there are literally thousands of unnecessary regulations that invade every facet of business and indeed very much of our personal lives, that are unnecessary, that government can do without, that have added $130 billion to the cost of production in this country, and that are contributing their part to inflation. And I would like to see us a little more free as we once were. We have only leased out and begun to explore 2% of our outer continental shelf for oil. Probably 70% of the potential oil in the United States is probably hidden in those lands, and no one is allowed to even go and explore to find out if it is there.
Big Oil also began taking drilling operations into deeper waters, where their exploits became much more risky. The government downplayed this risk, and the American public had been convinced they could rely on the oil industry to do what was best for the environment and our way of life. Reagan would pass the torch to his number 2, and finally the oil industry had one of their own in office. 2 months later,
an oil tanker smashed into a reef near Valdez, Alaska today, causing the worst oil spill since the Alaska pipeline opened 12 years ago.
It is interesting to note that BP owned Alyeska, the company in charge of the Exxon Valdez cleanup. By studying the fallout from the Exxon Valdez spill and the following cleanup process, we can get an accurate idea of what lies ahead for the Gulf ecosystem and its residents.
We felt that by mentioning Alyeska, people would look into it and discover, oh yes, it was dominated by BP. So we didn't name those names. In retrospect, I wish dearly we had, because it could have caused a change in the internal corporate climate. Transparency, public attention makes a huge difference. And in the Exxon Valdez case, the attention was diverted almost entirely on a captain who had had a few drinks.
Another thing we believed was there'll only be short-term harm in the ecosystem. And, you know, we actually questioned the scientists on that, and it turned out that that was based on a 1970s science that had been done for the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act. And the scientists didn't have any reason not to believe it. It's sort of like the world is flat until you suddenly discover the world is round, and then everything changes, right? So everything changed with the Exxon Valdez oil spill. The oil that washed ashore happened to be in the nurseries for the pink salmon and the herring. And the fishermen and the native people said, how can this be? You know, here are these little eggs, and here's all this oil. What's going to happen? So we're going to wait. We're going to wait. We picked 4 years because that was when the herring should have matured and become adults, was in 4 years. And it's when the pink salmon, the ones that survived, their offspring should have come back as adults. And one of our questions was, what's going to happen to those little baby fish? Are they going to be able to reproduce normally? So we picked 4 years, and it turns out in 4 years, that's when the ecosystem collapsed in Prince William Sound. And all the scientists were saying, how can this be? How can this be? So the world was all of a sudden round. And it took the scientists another 8 years to do all the laboratory studies and the field studies to sort of validate the new world order, you know, that oil is more toxic than the scientists thought in the 1970s.
Basically, herring in that area crashed and never came back after the spill. We lost about estimated 250,000 birds, seabirds, And thousands of, and we also lost eagles, quite a few bald eagles, because they feed on dead carrion, and so anything oiled was munch time for them. And we lost a pod of orcas, and we lost a good many sea otters as well.
One group had brain dysfunction, and they had short-term memory loss, and they couldn't concentrate, and they felt like they were in a fog all the time, you know. And then there was another group that had asthma, and then another group with heart irregularities, and then just general malaise, chronic fatigue, and just couldn't function very well at all. A lot of muscle aches, joint aches, and things like that, you know.
Exxon spilled nearly 11 million gallons of crude into Prince William Sound. Over 500,000 birds and wildlife were killed, and more than 6,000 people would be diagnosed with chronic illnesses believed to be caused by the cleanup process. It was becoming clear that the effects of this disaster were going to be serious and long-term. What is in store for the Gulf Coast residents working on the cleanup? Are they going to experience the same health issues in the next few decades that the Valdez workers are dealing with now? This era of deregulation led to the expansion of power for big oil in the United States. The interaction between corporate and governmental agendas had become blurred and enabled corporations to influence elections and U.S. policymaking like never before. Unfortunately, with the expansion of lobbyism in the late 90s, this type of corporate power and influence would continue to grow exponentially throughout administrations to come.
Basically, this is an industry that has been dominant in U.S. politics for a very long time, but that dominance actually is only recently been as strong as it is now in modern history, and that really began around the year 2000, and it really began with the coming into office of the Bush administration in the level of extremes that we're witnessing right now, and those extremes are the Bush administration essentially opening up new avenues of operation for BP or for the oil industry, dramatically reducing regulation, dramatically reducing oversight, dramatically reducing enforcement.
The oil industry spent more money on the George W. Bush administration in 2000 than any election in history. For their generosity, they received a president, vice president, secretary of Interior, Secretary of Commerce, and Secretary of State, who were all former oil company officials. This administration did more than any other to further the interests of big oil through deregulation, lack of enforcement, new access to public lands and oceans, subsidies, tax breaks, and war. In fact, the revolving door between government and the oil industry is all too familiar.
What we do know is that basically within the first few days of taking office, the Bush administration, gave Cheney the right to make this task force. He was allowed to call all of his best buddies from his days in the oil industry over, and not just oil, but coal and gas and all these other fossil fuels. But he called them over, and they had all these series of meetings here over months to come up with a policy plan that would go on to guide the next 8 years of this administration. This was this task force document they put out was basically a wish list for the oil, gas, and coal industries. It was, asking for ways to weaken regulations. It was asking for numerous incentives to, among other things, drill offshore.
You name it. If it was supervised, if it was overseen, if it was regulated by the federal government, Cheney, with his marvelous bureaucratic talent, moved in and essentially replaced the people who were in the positions that were central to this regulation, this oversight, with people who were either lobbyists for the industry being regulated or executives from that industry.
The Bush-Cheney administration enacted one of the most pro-oil, anti-environment pieces of legislation in history. the Energy Policy Act of 2005. In particular, Section 390 of the Act dramatically extended the circumstances under which new drilling permits could be approved without further environmental review. The Minerals Management Service, or MMS, which is responsible for the inspection and oversight of energy companies, approved the project using this type of categorical exclusion. In fact, BP was lobbying to expand the use of such exemptions less than 2 weeks before the Deepwater Horizon disaster.
He destroyed the regulatory mechanisms in America.
Give us some examples.
Cheney left, I'm told, somewhere around 1,600 plus people in the administration whom he had converted from being political, or he had recruited as civil service. He converted them to civil service if they were political, and left them in these positions that are very key to regulation and oversight. And those people will take a year and a half, maybe even 2 years for the Obama administration to root out and get rid of.
It was astonishing that a federal regulatory agency was corrupted so intrinsically by the industry they were supposed to be regulating. How could this have happened? In 1982, Congress passed the Federal Oil and Gas Royalty Management Act, which mandates the protection of the environment and conservation of federal lands in the course of developing oil and gas facilities. Reagan chose James Watt to be his Secretary of the Interior. Watt was a controversial figure, well known for his anti-environmental policies.
It was the Federal Oil and Gas Royalty Management Act that set it up, but it was specifically to not only exploit the offshore resources, but to protect the environment. And they certainly have done a good job on the one hand with exploiting the resources, but they have done a very poor job with protecting the environment. And you have to remember that all of these resources are in the common trust, they're the public trust.
In spite of the fact that you read it repeatedly over and over. The facts are not one lease or well was drilled in a park or wilderness area during my predecessor's time or my time or in the successor's time, because it's just not desirable or legal.
Did anybody go in sideways? You know, they were doing that, weren't they? Start from the outside and go in underneath. Boy, you were sneaky to watch these.
In New Mexico, we did one well and we slant drilled. They were outside the boundaries there.
Yeah.
And they came drilling in, snaking that old noodle right down in there.
Yeah.
And hopefully found oil, so we don't have to be so dependent upon those Persian Gulf states. I don't want to have America in a hostage situation to the Arabs surrounding the Persian Gulf.
Reagan invented James Watt, okay? He invented James Watt because he knew what James Watt was. He was nothing more than an ideologue buffoon. Not only was he not qualified to do the job, his ideology didn't allow him to do the job. He came from an industry that hated government. The mining industry where he comes from around Wyoming, they hated government because government was making them actually pay taxes for taking our natural resources. Government was making them, when they drilled, do it without destroying our waterways and our air.
Watt cut funds for environmental programs and ensured there would be less regulation on the federal level. He had no concern for conservation and proposed that by the turn of the century, all 80 million acres of U.S. wilderness become available for drilling and mining.
Matter of fact, there's something that you go back and look, it's called the Sagebrush Rebellion. The Sagebrush Rebellion was exactly those mining people and that Western industry. It was the Coors family. It was Richard Mellon Scaife. It was the Koch brothers. All of those guys said, we are going to change government. Ronald Reagan was the guy they put up to do that. Ronald Reagan was a man who had no history of accomplishing anything, really. They put him in office as governor of California. This is a guy who sold borax soap on for General Electric television. I mean, what was it? I forget the name of the show, but he had some Western cowboy show, and he sold borax soap. So they take this guy, he has a great face, he talks well, and we're going to put him in government. And so they put him in government, but he's their boy, you understand. Ronald Reagan is corporate America's boy. And so as corporate America's boy, they ask him to deliver something. Take government off our back. How do they do that? They create new agencies. One of them was mineral management. Mineral management was created by Reagan for ideologue dimwits like James Watt. So James Watt then does exactly what we'd expect. He hires people just like him. From the top to bottom, they are dimwits, they're intellectual lightweights, and more importantly, they are people who are looking for jobs because they can't get jobs anywhere else. I mean, they're minimally qualified, and every time they're supposed to be regulating, what really they're doing is they're saying, you know, at the dinner table with this corporation they're supposed to be regulating, are you going to give me a job? And so the quid pro quo, the trade-off is, if you're going to give me a job, I'm going to let you do what the hell you want to do.
James Watt created the Minerals Management Service to be responsible for the leasing of public lands for exploration and collection of oil and gas revenue for the government, as well as to ensure that companies were operating lawfully and protecting the safety of their workers and the environment. The Gulf would be the main site for deepwater exploration, becoming what environmentalists termed a national sacrifice area. Today, 99% of the nation's offshore oil production occurs in the Gulf. The MMS became a partner to the oil industry. Because they were so interconnected, their regulatory authority disintegrated. MMS officials ignored environmental reviews, were lenient in pursuing companies over equipment failures, and abandoned proposals that would have improved safety. The resulting imbalance of authority led to a culture conducive to corruption.
There's a concept in government called regulatory capture, and that is that the regulating agency works so closely with the industry. They deal with each other every day, they start to know each other. Capture occurs when they when they become so comfortable that it is the industry that dictates to the regulatory agency what happens rather than the other way around. And a lot of people use the phrase that the regulatory agency is in bed with the industry, and they use it as a metaphor, but you can literally say that happened with Mineral Management Service and some of the oil and gas companies that they were supposed to be overseeing. The Inspector General for inspecting the Minerals Management Service in 2008 found just some really egregious, some R-rated violations of ethics, and I think the best quote that I heard was, well, if you're in bed with the people you're supposed to regulate, you can't be at arm's length, which is pretty much sums it up. Yeah, absolutely.
The Office of the Inspector General gave us a glimpse into this culture through investigative reports that tell startling stories of the Minerals Management Service and its relationship with the oil industry. One investigation found Director Gregory W. Smith worked for an outside engineering firm and used his role in the MMS to connect them with industry clients. He often requested that subordinates provide him with cocaine, crystal meth, and engage in sexual activities. Another investigation revealed that MMS employees had accepted gifts from the oil and gas industry on numerous occasions. These are direct violations of government ethics standards, and one representative admitted that business was never conducted at such events. The investigations also found emails laden with sexual innuendos from industry representatives inviting MMS officials to parties. There was also evidence that employees took steps to keep their social contacts with the industry a secret. The investigation uncovered emails from MMS employees stating their attendance was to be, quote, kept quiet, and that they should RSVP in private. It was also proven that MMS employees frequently consumed alcohol, cocaine, and marijuana at these functions, as well as had sexual relations with oil industry representatives.
The Minerals Management Service, MMS, Lake Charles District, we're all oil industry. The report saying oil industry officials would fill out safety inspection reports themselves in pencil, and MMS inspectors would then trace over them in pen before signing them. Then there was the inspector who showed up for work still high on crystal meth, and the other inspector who inspected 4 offshore rigs of a company he was at the time negotiating with for a job, which he got. The rigs, meanwhile, got no violations. And the other inspectors who got free lunches from Big Oils, and other meals, too, and gifts, and golfing, and shooting, and hunting trips, and tickets to the 2005 Peach Bowl. The bigger problem, perhaps not the gifts, but the suggestion they were unnecessary at a revolving door agency filled with childhood friends of employees of the oil industry. A ConocoPhillips employee emailing an MMS inspector, quote, "Ever get bribed? They try all the time. Ever take them? I accept, quote, gifts from certain people, but we have very strict ethics standards, as you could imagine. Certain people, the ConocoPhillips employee asks, meaning women? No, the MMS inspector writes, meaning good friends that I wouldn't write up anyway."
MMS was asleep at the wheel, and that needs to be corrected. They were more of a lapdog as opposed to a watchdog. And the fact that BP's plans were approved when they talked about walruses and seals. We don't have any walruses and seals down here, so obviously either nobody read it or somebody read it, didn't even pay attention to it. And you know, it's probably worse if they read it and approved it. You can understand maybe not reading it.
MMS adopted wholesale for its oil and gas drilling best practices proposals of the American Petroleum Institute. And then they made most of those best practices only suggestions. There's been virtually no enforcement. According to the MMS website, between 2000 and 2009, civil penalties averaged less than $130 per well per year on our outer continental shelf. And only 3 criminal referrals were made to the department since 1990 in the last 20 years. Add it all up, and there is no real question MMS was a captive regulator.
Give them some penalties that will give them incentive, you know, not to do this, no matter how much money they get under the table and all that kind of stuff. If they're going to go to prison for the rest of their life for getting in bed with BP, you know, you don't let them retire replace them and let them retire, and you know that it's been too pedal too softly. You know, they need some real penalties on the people who's supposed to be the watchdog. If they're not the watchdog, you know, China takes them out and shoots them. I don't think we can do that, but that's you know, you need to get serious with these people.
Finally, everything was becoming clear. Deregulation and the government's faith in big industry spawned these types of incestuous relationships and led the government officials to simply look the other way while BP operated at the expense of the American public and the environment. Although the MMS requires some companies to identify what they can do to reduce a project's environmental impact, the agency grants hundreds of waivers each year. It was these types of federal waivers that essentially gave BP complete control over its drilling projects. In fact, just before the Deepwater Horizon explosion, a senior director from BP America wrote to the council saying these exemptions would help the industry avoid unnecessary paperwork and time delays. Traveling further down the coast, more and more upset residents, government officials, and specialists wanted to speak out, such as Billy Nungesser, president of Plaquemines Parish. He is a staunch political force in Louisiana's state government who had first-hand experience dealing with BP from the beginning of this disaster. He had discovered that BP's only concern seemed to be protecting their bottom line at almost any cost.
for 11 people who were on a drilling platform when it exploded, sending up a wall of fire.
The explosion sent 6 people to USA Medical Center. One of them was sent to the hospital's burn unit.
This rig is more than 50 miles southeast of Venice, off Louisiana's tip.
I stood in Venice and listened to the radio transmission as they pulled people out the water, and they kept those men on the back of that boat for 24 hours. That's when you knew something was wrong with this company. It was being run by a bunch of lawyers. Why they didn't bring those people into Venice? I was standing by with our ambulances waiting to care for them. They kept them on a boat for 24 hours. That in itself is criminal. And it started from there and it went downhill.
And we read that oil workers from the rig were held in seclusion on the open water for up to 2 days after the April 20 explosion, while attorneys attempted to convince them to sign legal documents stating that they were unharmed by the incident. The men claimed that they were forbidden from having any contact with concerned loved ones during that time and were told that they would not be able to go home until they signed the documents they were presented with. After being awake for 50 harrowing hours, Stephen Davis caved in and signed the papers. He said most of the others did as well. Do you think this is an appropriate way to treat people that experience that?
Imagine what it would have been like to be in that situation. So you eventually made it in the lifeboat to a supply ship and then back to shore to a hotel, which is where you were asked by Transocean to sign this waiver that I have in my hand here, which says you were asked, I was not a witness to the incident requiring the evacuation and have had no firsthand or personal knowledge regarding the incident. You put your signature to that. You were also asked if you were injured, and you said, I was not injured as a result of the incident or the evacuation. Why did they say to you that they wanted you to sign these?
They told me and my wife were actually about to leave the hotel to come home. They caught me right before I went out of the door. They told me it was just a statement saying that I was off tower, that I wasn't working, I didn't see what happened leading up to the incident. And, me and my wife were just trying to get home to see the rest of our family, and they said just, sign here, initial here, sign this.
Tragedy of the 11 people out there, many of these people came from our communities, and so there was really a human tragedy there that probably wasn't felt as much in other parts of the country, but it was very much felt here. People knew these people and grieved with the families. And initially, the well is considered pretty far offshore. It was thought that, we thought, well, they'll get it under control. They had the blowout preventer on there. And so our hopes were raised every day and then dashed and raised and dashed, and I don't know how many times that happened.
For 4 days, the spill was thought to have been contained. All the while, crude oil was pumping into the Gulf. 42,000 gallons a day are gushing out, but should the well itself open, 100 times more crude could spew into the water. It could take vastly longer to contain than previously thought.
My initial reaction was I felt terrible for the families of the people who lost their lives on the rig, and I thought nothing of the fact that, well, they might not be able to plug this thing. I figured it'd be like any other disaster or any other accident in that type of industry. Well, a week and a half, 2 weeks go by, and they plug it up and boom it off around the rig, and that's the end of it. The funerals go on for the lost lives of the workers, but I don't think anybody had any idea what that was going to lead to. And I was kind of one of the ones, I stayed real positive. Once everybody started to kind of realize just how bad this could possibly be, I try to stay positive. That's the only way that I can deal with things. And I was thinking, oh, well, maybe it's a naturally occurring product, so maybe it won't be that toxic on the environment. Maybe there's not near as much as they're saying that's leaking, and there's only so much that you can tell yourself, and you go out there and see that stuff every day, and just thinking, God, we go out there and our boat looks like we've been in a battlefield. Stuff, all over the place, nasty shovels and oil all over the boat. And after a day of doing that, you just saying to yourself, this Gulf that basically my way of life could possibly be over for a long time. And that was the hardest pill for me to swallow. And I had a hard time after seeing how bad it really was staying positive.
There are many checks before you get to activating the blowout preventer. That is the ultimate fail-safe mechanism, and for whatever reason, and we don't understand that yet, but we clearly will as a consequence of both our investigation and federal investigations, it failed to operate.
In November of last year, Transocean pulled out the blowout preventer from the ocean floor because its shear rams weren't working. The lower annular would not close, and the upper annular had been stripped through during a well control event.
This is an annular blowout preventer. It's actually a 20-inch bore. The ones used on the Horizon were higher pressure and 18 3/4 inch bore, but there would have been two roughly this size in the blowout preventer stack, and these are primarily the main devices used to actually seal off the well bore, either to prevent a kick or during testing. And they basically have a rubber elastomer that can expand and contract with hydraulic pressure to seal off the well bore.
We know that BP was aware of this because Transocean, and again, it's document number 12 there in our binder, reflect conference calls with BP about the problems with this blowout preventer.
Just before he lands, he realizes he has not engaged his landing gear. So he puts the landing gear, and the landing gear doesn't get down in time and the plane crashes. So we have an investigation on how do we get better landing gears. And to me, that's what we have here. We're looking at the wrong thing. We're spending too much time looking at the blowout preventers. The blowout preventers are the landing gear. And what we should be focusing on is the procedures that were done.
As you can see, your engineers said that if you used a long string of casing, quote, it is unlikely to be a successful cement job. You would be unable to fulfill MMS regulations, and there would be an open annulus to the wellhead. And I have that on the screen. Now, those are serious risks. A failed cement job, a violation of MMS safety regulations, an open pathway for gas to travel to the top of the well. The same document says that if you use the liner and tieback approach, which is what ExxonMobil and other companies said you should have used, you would have avoided or lessened these risks. Yet BP apparently overruled the warnings of its own engineers and chose the more dangerous option. How can you explain that decision by BP? Why were the safety recommendations of your own engineers ignored?
I wasn't involved in any of the decision making.
To have a blowout, you have to have a sequential type of errors. And what the first thing was is that they ran this long string of pipe in there. Number two was the installation of the pipe, and the procedures they used were wrong. From what I understand, they were in a hurry and they did not wait for additional centralizers to get there.
So the expert said you need 21. Then, and if we can put up the first slide, a BP employee essentially wrote to that expert and said, well, we've only got 6, and we don't have time to deal with this problem. Now, time to British Petroleum was money. This rig was 45 days late. It cost you $500,000 a day, and people's obvious attention were about time, which meant money. So what happened then? Well, another British Petroleum person sent a memo saying, we really need to follow the model here. He kicked it up to Mr. Guide. If we could have the second slide, Mr. Guide came back and said, I don't like the fact this is going to take 10 hours to do. Even though another British Petroleum person had said, we're going to fly 15 things in, they can be here tomorrow morning. Mr. Guide said, I don't like the 10 hours. And it didn't happen.
So what we have is that a number of things, they didn't centralize it, they didn't circulate long enough, they ran the wrong type of float equipment, they didn't have enough cement volume, and they didn't, and the type of cement they used may not have been correct. So you have a number of things there.
Is there any other well, to your knowledge, in the Gulf of Mexico that has been done in the same manner as this well that was being drilled under the Deepwater Horizon?
There are many wells in the Gulf of Mexico.
Are there any other wells where you haven't put the proper number of centralizers in?
There are many wells in the Gulf of Mexico that have the same casing design. There are many wells that have been drilled where the same cement procedure has been.
Now, have the Minerals and Management Service people been there and looked over those with a fine-tooth comb?
Everything that we do is subject to regulatory oversight.
Are you changing your procedures at those wells as a result of things that you've encountered in your investigation with
as
the
we
deep water?
learn, apologies. As we learn from our investigation, we will make appropriate changes, as I've already indicated.
The potential devastation to the Gulf Coast, its economy, and its people require us to continue our relentless efforts to stop the leak and contain the damage. There's already been a loss of life, damage to our coastline, to fish and wildlife, and to the livelihoods of everyone from fishermen to restaurant and hotel owners.
The fact that, they had even less confidence in where this oil was heading told us that we need to have a sense of urgency and we need to start working to protect ourselves. And we had our first impact on May 12th, 3 days after declaring emergency with tar balls hitting the beach. And then 7 days later, we had our first major impact with heavy brown crude oil ending up basically scattered most of the 12 miles of beach that we have here at Fouchon Beach. So
it was so unbelievably different from one day to the next. It was just a joke. We had different bosses every day. We had different people we were answering to. We had different partner boats, different people on our task force. We would just get trained in doing something and felt like we were like, okay, we're trained, we're adequate to do this job. And then they tell us to go do something else. Tell us, hey, why don't you go check on that boom? Well, we're getting pretty good at picking up this oil. Why don't you let us keep doing this? We want to keep our waters clean. No, we need you over here checking this boom after 67 other boats have already checked it. So it was like that every day. I mean, then I could go on about getting paid, and you're going to get paid, and within a week after submitting your invoice. Yeah, my ass. The whole thing was just a debacle.
BP came in here and they put me out of the shrimp business, they put me out of the fish business, they put me out of the retail business because they took our tourists away. They put us out of the ice business because we make 130 tons of ice a day, and if the shrimp ain't running, they don't need no ice. And the only thing we had left was the fuel business, and BP brought in outsiders from Texas and parked the bar that don't pay no taxes over here, don't pay nothing, and just, I asked them if they wanted my dog and my wife too. You might as well take everything I got,
They all showed up, I can't fish right now. There's a saying that I do what I do best, and that's fish. Do what you do best and pray for the rest. A good friend of mine told me that years ago, and it's kind of stuck in my head, and it's what I do. I am a charter fisherman.
This is what you call not a disaster. This is I don't know what you want to call it, but this is the worst that it could ever happen. And it's not just us. Hey, we got people from Mississippi, Alabama, Florida. We have a lot of people from Florida that come fish off of here, king mackerels and snappers that fishes here too. Mississippi comes over here to shrimp. So it's not just Louisiana that's going to be affected. We have people from Texas come here just to work these areas. So it's everybody that's going to be affected with this oil spill. Everybody.
Oil spill hit at the absolute worst time for our community. The businesses we have here are all local, family-owned businesses. We don't have very many, if any, big corporations that are set up in town operating. And so they really, throughout the summer, bank their money. That's when they earn the money. There's about 100 days of summer. We try to sneak through the fall and over the winter and kind of get by until spring break. This year, 2010 spring break season was a breakout year. We had good growth. We had 8 or 9% growth in tourism. We had good money flowing in. People had, after the different hurricane seasons that we had and had some rebuilding and some growth, and then we had a downturn in the economy, all of a sudden this seemed to be the year where it was upticking. And so before the season started, which is really our Memorial Day starts our summer season, before it got here and ever got started, we had the brakes put on and struggled all summer long. And now I'm hoping that the businesses can survive through the winter, through another down period, and be prepared in springtime. So we're fighting not necessarily for 2010 anymore. Now we're fighting to survive to get to 2011 next year, to make sure that the businesses that are here can be here next year.
It was double-digit decline in business, some 20%. Some of the real estate folks were down 30%. These businesses in Pensacola thrive on a June, July, August vacation period. That's when they make their money. That's when they save their money to make it through the rest of the year. And that business was down appreciably. And there were some businesses that were saying, we don't know if we can make it.
It bothers me that they'll hire people from out of town, out of state, and won't hire me. This is my living, this is my way of life. I want it back.
Larry, thanks very much. Breaking news tonight, potentially chilling news. A leading expert, who you'll hear from in a minute, has examined this video of oil gushing into the Gulf of Mexico, and what he says is horrifying. The leak, which the Coast Guard estimates at 5,000 barrels a day, could be far worse, 10 times worse. And that's the bottom end of his estimated range, which means that this expert is talking about, at a bare minimum, about the equivalent of one Exxon Valdez spill every 4 days.
I think they lied about the amount of oil that was going into the Gulf immediately. I will say that, L-I-E-D, lied. You know, they knew that more oil was going into the Gulf than they first admitted, okay? Their efforts to cap the well, their efforts to do this, whatever, that's all fine and dandy, but all in all, I wasn't very happy with BP.
And there's an area called Barataria Bay, and I would suggest you go look it up. About a week and a half ago, there was no oil in Barataria Bay. That section was scheduled to be covered by the barrier plan that still to this day hasn't been approved. Now today, there's oil, thick oil, coming into Barataria Bay. And so you're not showing the sense of urgency. And whether it's you or the federal government, we've got oil in Barataria Bay when we had a plan a month ago to keep the oil out of Barataria Bay. And so when people are hearing that everything's being done, I'm going to tell you, on the ground, it's not getting done. And I don't know what you need to do differently, but you need to go do something differently. And if it's not you that's blocking it, you need to tell somebody who's blocking it, because it's being blocked. And it's not getting done on the ground, and we don't have the luxury of time. This shouldn't be happening.
Tropical storm, they were bringing boom out to safety. Then last night, they were bringing the same boom out because it was the defective Chinese boom. So what is it? Right. We were lied to. Right. We continue to be lied to. And I told the second commander I just came from meeting with, I told her everything. I don't hold back. And she says, well, I don't expect you to trust me by saying it. I need to show you by action. I said, you absolutely do. And I said, from this moment on, you have an opportunity. Here's my phone numbers. For any equipment moves in this parish, I deserve a phone call. So there's your chance.
After it became obvious we were going to have to deal with it, then the focus and the working relationship with BP was, how do we deal with it? How do we clean it up? How do we get it skimmed before it gets here? How do we protect our backwater areas? You know, that kind of working relationship, which started off pretty rocky because they had transitioning people in and out before they ever had anybody permanently located here. And we were dealing with one guy 1 week, and they'd take a 2-week reprieve and be gone, and we'd be dealing with somebody else, and there was no consistency.
I felt like we were completely in the dark. No one knew anything. Scientists didn't know anything. You couldn't get any information out of anyone that you thought should know something. I mean, I worked at Hopedale when they were just setting up the volunteer system, and no one there knew anything that was going on. I mean, you'd walk to the Fish and Wildlife trailer and they didn't know what was going on, and you know, it just really was blank. It was a blank. And I said, Homer, still don't know who. I call Homer the Wizard of Oz. It's some man hiding behind a curtain, because nobody, they still couldn't give me a name. Well, I'll find out who in Homer. I said, well, when you do, let me know, because we'll travel that yellow brick road together. Because I can't, but for the life of me, to see how a town of Homer can make so many decisions without having a name behind it.
Communications were not what they should be. I think everybody would agree to that. The Unified Command, of course, was over in Mobile, and what our premise was, that we in Pensacola knew our beaches, we knew our bays, we knew our bios, we knew how to take care of them. Let us have more control. But all the control, all the requests had to go through that particular chain of command. And it took a long time, and it was very, very frustrating because, as I said before, we knew we had this horrible problem, but there were so many questions as to how to combat it. It was a huge unknown.
BP out of the way would raise a question to replace them with what?
Only BP, he said, has the equipment and expertise to plug a leak a mile below the surface. The government does not. And he said he's still confident BP, with aggressive pressure from the government, will get the job done.
What that Al told me yesterday, I'm 51% in charge. Are you a little pregnant? Did you kiss your sister? I mean, what's 51% in charge? Either you're in charge. What kind of leader tells you, hey, look, we're going into war, but I'm 51. If you get shot, that's on the 49% that ain't in charge. You know, if we win this, I mean, how do you tell the troops, hey guys, let's go fight this war, I'm 51% in charge? It's a business deal.
Now we are operating 6 remote operated vehicles simultaneously around the blowout preventer, both monitoring the blowout preventer and trying to close in the flow of oil. Development Driller 3 is now on location, and we expect to start drilling the relief well within 48 hours. We've also a new technique identified yesterday afternoon, which is to try to deploy dispersants at the source, at the location subsea.
Well, what they told us was the disbursements would break it up, make it sink to the bottom, and it wouldn't come ashore, that I was being paranoid. It wasn't going to come ashore, it was going to stay offshore. And 3 weeks and 4 days from that time, Paso Lutra got inundated with oil. And I went back out 5 days in a row. Then on the 7th day, I brought Anderson Cooper and the governor out there. And a week later, I brought Anderson Cooper back. Still nobody did anything. And then the 3rd week, still. It was almost a month that oil sat out there with birds diving in the oil. All the fish in that area died. There was no life in that marsh, and that marsh is dead. It'll wash away, and South Louisiana will start about a half-mile inland. That marsh will be gone next year.
In the dictionary.com definition of disperse, 1, to drive or send off in various directions, to scatter, definition 2, to spread wildly, disseminate, to dispel, cause to vanish. So really what they're doing, if you get to the core of this, and keep me honest on this, but really what they're doing is making us not be able to see the disaster that is in our Gulf. They're not fixing anything. We just can't see it anymore.
The difference here is that we have put these surfactants out at unprecedented quantities. It's an open ocean spill. The other unprecedented part of this is that we've put surfactants at the wellhead a mile down in the water. So we have dispersed oil through the entire water column. Now what was misleading about what EPA has been coming out with, they said that oil and oil plus dispersants, there's no difference in the toxicity of these two. The difference that they're glossing over, that's technically true, okay. That oil and oil plus dispersants have the same toxicity or similar toxicity on a concentration per concentration basis, right? They have similar toxicity. The difference is the bioavailability, and this is what was misleading about the pronouncements where they keep saying over and over again, the government saying that there's no difference in the toxicity of the oil and the oil plus dispersants. What that glosses over is that with the oil plus dispersants, you have increased the bioavailability, which increases the toxic effect. It doesn't necessarily increase the toxicity of the molecules, but it increases the toxic effect because it increases bioavailability.
Our workers, our fishermen, went out and worked on the oil spill response, and they were told, oh, the oil is not toxic, it's going to be as safe as pancake syrup. And people got sick. People were coughing, headaches, dizziness, nausea. It's like a TB ward out there. I mean, everybody's hacking and choking and coughing. What is going on? And I said, well, I don't know, but surely the medical doctors will take care of this. And again, this is another example of we trusted the medical community. We trusted the federal and state laws that are put in place to protect workers. And it turns out there was loopholes driven into all those laws by the oil companies and by the petrochemical industry, so that those laws all missed that the workers were sick because of oil from the Exxon Valdez and the chemical dispersants that were used. So no, nobody took care of them either, and I still am dealing now with cleanup workers from the Exxon Valdez 21 years later who are saying, you know, I thought I had the Valdez crud in 1989. That's what Exxon told us, just a little cold, a little flu. I didn't think I'd have it for 14 years, 18 years, 21 years. What is wrong with me?
Hearing story after story of BP's immoral, profit-motivated operations and the accompanying negligence that caused the explosion, which claimed 11 lives, the human effects of this spill were becoming more apparent on a visceral level.
Whenever I heard that they were cleaning the oil spill in the Gulf, I realized that it was deja vu all over again. It was me and my crew out there cleaning and becoming sick, not being able to breathe, and suffering with the flu-like symptoms with stomach disorder. It would become like bronchitis. And when we went to the doctor, they only said, it's the flu and it's going around and everyone has it.
More and more stories about sick fishermen are beginning to surface. They're out in the Gulf, many of them all day, every day, working to clean up the spill. Many blame the chemicals BP is using. One fisherman told me tonight he felt like he was going to die over the weekend.
It's like a sniffing gasoline or something. You know, and my ears are popping right now. I'm still coughing up stuff. I feel real weak, the tingling.
Marine toxicologist Ricky Ott says the chemicals used by BP can wreak havoc on a person's body and even lead to death.
The volatile organic carbons they act like a narcotic on the brain, and at high concentrations, what we learned in Exxon Valdez from carcasses of harbor seals and sea otters, it actually literally fried the brain lesions.
Congressman Charlie Melasaw wants something done. He sent a letter to the Obama administration calling for temporary health care clinics to be set up
close by so that there can be immediate attention to any people that feel that they have problems, adverse problems caused by the inhalation or exposure to the oil.
According to testimony we heard in Louisiana, still BP failed to provide respirators to the workers exposed to the crude oil, and the workers experienced health impacts. The workers were afraid to speak up due to the potential to lose their jobs. Those fishermen who attempted to wear respirators while working were threatened to be fired by BP due to the workers using the respirators. Do you know anything about that?
I'm not aware of that.
Now, the Federal Environmental Protection Agency has been tracking what's in the air by using a mobile truck and 7 monitoring stations located mainly in St. Bernard and Plaquemines parishes. They are looking for evidence of several compounds, including hydrogen sulfide and volatile organic compounds, or VOCs, like benzene, which is commonly known as swamp gas. A normal level ranges from 5 to 10 parts per billion. At the Venice station on May 2nd, the levels recorded were 30 parts per billion. The next day, the reading was nearly 40 times that, at nearly 1,200 parts per billion. And the day after that, it dropped down to 46, before rising the next day to more than 1,000.
The air quality is not good. We've been having trouble, you know. I've been seeing people sick, you know, eyes crying a lot, nasal passages stopped up, a sore throat. You know, it's, I don't think it's safe. You know, my wife just refused to leave.
My daughter got sick. It was my daughter. She's 14, and we took her to the emergency room. She was having a headache real bad and all, so we took her to the emergency room, and they did tests and they couldn't find nothing wrong with her. So, and doctor said follow up with another doctor. She still has, so we took her to another doctor, and they drew in blood and they found chemicals in her urine and all, like different kind of chemicals.
The president also came here as a salesman to convince vacationers to come on down.
Beaches all along the Gulf Coast are clean, they are safe, and they are open for business. That's one of the reasons Michelle, Sasha, and I are here.
News 5 is doing some testing of our own.
News 5 investigation took us from Gulf Shores to Orange Beach, to Katrina Key, to the Dolphin Island Marina. We collected samples of water, sand, and when we saw kids digging...
Do you mind if we get some water out of your sand hole here?
We got a sample of that, too. Bob Naiman is a chemist with nearly 30 years of experience. He tested our water and sand for oil and petroleum. Gulf Shores beach water, right where people were swimming, showed 66 parts per million. And the sand, where beachgoers are walking, has 211 parts per million. The sixth sample was a spot in Orange Beach where, again, we found kids playing. And we found our highest content of oil and petroleum, 221 parts per million. But the tests didn't stop there. The sample we haven't yet told you about is the one collected from Dolphin Island Marina. This sample exploded right in his lab.
I mean, like almost instantaneous. Actually, maybe 1 second. It's just weird.
The results surprised even our chemist.
We think that it most likely happened due to the presence of either methanol or methane gas or the presence of the dispersant corrects it.
Across the Gulf, there were stories of sick people. I mean, emergency room, puking brown, peeing brown. This is internal hemorrhaging. This is what the EPA whistleblower Hugh Kaufman was talking about. This is what the material safety data sheets talk about, internal hemorrhaging.
I think that the use of dispersants is criminal. I mean, essentially, by allowing BP to use dispersants rather than forcing them to come and skim and remove the oil from the top of the Gulf surface, we have legally allowed them to use the Gulf, our Gulf, as their disposal unit for oil. I mean, dispersants don't make the oil go away. They simply make it smaller, they make it dissolve into the water, they make it break down to where it's true, to where oil-eating microbes can break it down at a faster rate, absolutely true. But what it also means is the other billions of organisms in the Gulf that aren't oil-eating microbes can also absorb it and bioaccumulate it at a much faster rate. There were many studies after Valdez, for a decade after Exxon Valdez, and the overall message from all of these peer-reviewed scientific studies was dispersants, including core exit, increase the bioaccumulation of the PAHs, the carcinogenic component of oil, by anywhere from 12 to 50,000 times. So our laws are set up to where BP was allowed to dispose of their oil into our Gulf's food web, essentially. Big mistake.
News report that they had, it said that the snapper and mullet was safe to eat. Well, you can catch snapper in this bay. Snapper and mullet was safe to eat, but shrimp and crabs, stay away from them. They all habitat in the same bay. Nowhere else, they're in this bay. I mean, you know, if you want to say, well, how can snapper and mullet be safe and shrimp and crabs that side by side, I mean literally side by side, they're not safe. Something don't make sense with that picture. That picture doesn't sail with me at all. It was, if that was what it was meant to be said, and they said it that way, they're wrong. And I still wouldn't sell anything until all of these species are safe.
The dispersed oil is going to affect all of that. It's going to affect the eggs, the larvae, the food, everything in the plankton is going to be impacted. And so that area that's been affected is it's, you know, you probably shouldn't go as far as say sterilized, but I mean, the impact is huge.
My livelihood, the money that I live off of comes from selling fish and stuff. Yeah, I want it to be open, but would I personally eat anything that I catch? I certainly have my doubts. I would be a little bit apprehensive.
We expect to see a substantial reduction in the overall amount of dispersant used, primarily because they shouldn't need to be spraying it if they're able to disperse it earlier. If we start to see dispersant chemicals in that water or anywhere in the water column, then we're going to recommend strongly to the on-scene coordinator that we stop.
It was everywhere. It was obviously certain days would be worse than others, depending on how strong of a south wind we had or what the current was doing. But as I've said before, it was weird how being a fisherman and knowing the Gulf like I feel I know it, knowing what direction and how fast the currents moving and what the wind's doing. I mean, there was absolutely no rhyme or reason to being in the stuff for 2 weeks straight everywhere and knowing that there was a bunch of it to the east of us when we've got a current out of the east, and it should be just right over here the next day and it's gone. Just little white bubbles. And we heard rumors, and I can't confirm it, but I mean, there's no doubt they were sinking the stuff. They're spraying it with airplanes at night. I've got some friends, I'm not going to mention their names, but they worked offshore, stayed offshore for several days at a time, and they would tell them between 12 and 4, stay in your cabins because we're going to bomb it. We're going to spray it. From my understanding, that was not legal. That was not authorized by the government for them to do that. They did it anyway. Out of sight, out of mind has been their policy, and they lived up to that part of it.
The BP lied from day one, and they're still lying to people, so what's the difference, We asked them to quit spraying that disperser, because that's a killer, but they want to keep on hiding. They keep on spraying, they want to hide that oil under the ground, under the water where nobody can see it, which is wrong. Let the son of a bitch come to the top of the water and let them skim it.
I've been on record for a long time being against use of that dispersant. I'm not against use of a dispersant. There's a lot of organic dispersants, and that's what I was talking about earlier. People can't get their products to BP to be considered. I've seen a lot of organic dispersants that could have been used. I have a problem with the dispersants they use because it's core exit. There's corporate relationships between BP and the company that manufactures core exit. It's banned in the United Kingdom. If it's not good enough for the United Kingdom, it shouldn't be good enough for the Gulf of Mexico, number one. Number two, I think this dispersant, the solution may be worse than the problem. And three, the dispersant has actually complicated the skimming of this oil because it's forced it underneath, and it's also been like trying to track a ghost. So, again, I think the federal government failed us there because, again, just like we talked about former MMS, now Department of Ocean and Energy, the EPA has been basically a lapdog and not a watchdog because they've requested and they've said on record they've told BP not to use it, but guess what? They continue to use it despite that.
EPA told them stop using it because it's toxic to human beings. BP said no. Right. Now we've learned there's not anything else out there in the kind of quantity they need. So they're putting something toxic to human beings and harmful to sea life in the sea?
It's interesting, Shepard.
Not to me.
An Exxon report some years ago showed that the core exit is actually 4 times more toxic than the crude oil itself.
Would you say that again?
In this case, these dispersants were used in massive quantities, almost 2 million gallons so far, to hide the magnitude of the spill and save BP money. And the government, both EPA, NOAA, etc., have been sock puppets for BP in this cover-up. Now, by hiding the amount of spill, BP is saving hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars in fines. And so from day one, there was tremendous economic incentive to use these dispersants to hide the magnitude of the gusher that's been going on for almost 3 months. One thing that I did want to mention to you, Amy, that's occurred in most investigations, back even in the Watergate days, people said, follow the money. And that's correct. In this case, you've got to follow the money. Who saves money by using these toxic dispersants? Well, it's BP. But then the next question, I've only seen one article that describes it. Who owns BP? When you look and see who owns BP, you find that it's the majority ownership, 1 billion shares, is a company called BlackRock. Vanity Fair just did recently an article about Mr. Fink and his connections with Mr. Geithner, Mr. Summers, and others in the administration. So I think what's needed, we now know that there's a cover-up.
It was becoming obvious that Americans could no longer blindly trust their watchdog agencies.
Today, the federal government is releasing a new scientific analysis that addresses the question, where did the oil go? The key conclusions of the report is that the vast majority of the oil has either evaporated or been burned, skimmed, and recovered from the wellhead or dispersed. And much of the dispersed oil is in the process of relatively rapid degradation. A significant amount of this is a direct result of the very robust federal response efforts.
New evidence has badly shaken the Obama administration's rosy narrative about the alleged disappearance of most of the oil that gushed into the Gulf of Mexico from BP's Blowout well. Early this month, a report by government scientists declared 3/4 of the oil had vanished, either collected or dispersed. But numerous reports contradict the administration's sanguine picture of the cleanup effort. Researchers at the University of Georgia said about 3/4 of the oil is still lurking below the surface of the Gulf and may pose a threat to the ecosystem. Separately, a study released last week by the University of South Florida scientists found oil and sediments of an underwater canyon and evidence that the oil has become toxic to critical marine organisms. On Thursday, a team of researchers confirmed the existence of a vast underwater oil plume stretching 21 miles from BP's Blowout well. Christopher Reddy of Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution said the amount of oil in the plume is unknown.
Now it is clear how and why BP, with the help of the federal government, willfully caused this disaster and continually tried to sweep this toxic soup under the rug.
I don't care if you're Democrat, Republican, Independent, Green Party. Look, let's face it. They dropped the ball in not protesting these toxins or these dispersants being spread in our water. We don't know the long-term effect.
If that wasn't bad enough, the desperate, out-of-work Gulf Coast residents were forced to do the hazardous sweeping without proper safety gear. The final insult was the cleanup workers' gross underpayment, which leads us to the last subject, compensation.
The only way you intend to pay those claims is if it comes through this fund. Is that your testimony
$20 billion
today?
is a very large sum of money to pay claims.
I'm sorry?
$20 billion is a very large fund to pay claims from.
It is a large fund, and is it your view that part of what that fund will be used for is to pay people for their long-term health care costs incurred as a result of this spill?
That will be a decision for the independent adjudicator.
Well, if they asked you what you thought, would you say yes, the health care costs should be paid for from this?
I think that's something that I will leave him to decide. That's why we've appointed an independent adjudicator.
So
he's the guy that settled all of the Agent Orange suits from the Vietnam War. He's the fella that was the trust fund administrator for 9/11 after the collapse of the World Trade Center. And you can imagine how complicated that was, especially with all of the deaths that occurred from that tragedy. He is the fellow that was called upon to Virginia in the Virginia Tech massacre to solve those problems. Here we have the world's expert to step in and smooth out this process and to see that just and due compensation is given to people who have suffered as so many of us have suffered. Ken Feinberg.
I want to thank Senator Nelson. I'm here because Senator Nelson said be here. And when Senator Nelson asks you to do something, you do it.
What's going to happen to our fish, our crabs, our shrimp, our oysters? People are not buying our seafood now because of these toxins. How can British Petroleum make us whole on that issue?
You seem to be saying that oysters, that there's going to be potential long-term devastation to the ability to catch quota. I don't know if that's true. Do you know if that's true? There may be no long-term impact. Senator Nelson mentions my credibility doing these other projects. my credibility will last a very, very short time. If the money doesn't get delivered here to eligible claimants, beginning when I take over with the Gulf Coast Claims Facility on August 23rd, less than 2 weeks away.
BP has pounded home this message.
BP has got to make things right.
And they're spending $100 million on a PR blitz to tell the rest of the country they're making us whole. Guys, it's not true. It's not true.
And Mayor Tony Kennon of Orange Beach, Alabama, devastated when tourists stayed away, says the new independent claims administrator, Ken Feinberg, has not made things better.
So we're very upset with the overall performance of Ken Feinberg.
In an interview, Feinberg acknowledges problems.
We haven't processed all of the claims as quickly as we should have. I oversold this program at the beginning, and I'm paying the price for it.
I do not work for BP.
I'm still sitting over here. They cut me instead of helping me. They cut me from $5,000 to $2,300 a month. So you tell me.
What's happened with, and it's not just the BP scenario, it happens across the board. In America, we have this, because we value capitalism so much. We think capitalism really is a great system. It's potentially one of the best systems in the world, but it's become so remarkably flawed lately. Part of the flaw is that the people that you talk to along the coast, probably if you ask them what their sense of corporate America is, they don't really see them as criminals sometimes. Now, if we dress them up in an Armani suit, and we put $500 shoes on them, and we put Rolex watches on their hands, and we put them in a silk tie, all of a sudden, they may be completely a psychopath, but in their heart, they're still a criminal. We look at them differently than we do the kid who has 3 ounces of pot in a bag that we throw into prison for 2 years. Now, a corporation in this setting, let's just say what it is, they killed 11 people.
Right.
Okay, for all practical purposes, they created mass murder. Right. But still, you can't find people understanding that they're criminals because they look different. They're from Wall Street. They have a British accent. They're dressed up in an Armani suit. They have nice looking shoes. They talk intelligently. They have dinner with politicians. They know celebrities. And our culture doesn't allow us to understand that they're really just criminals.
The year before the spill, BP's sales equaled $239 billion. BP's total fines and settlements were a meager 0.3% of this. The oil industry is by far the most profitable industry in the world and includes 6 of the 10 largest corporations worldwide. This industry is now experiencing a level of power comparable only to the era of Standard Oil. We are currently standing at the crossroads. The choices we make in the next 5 years will impact our future generations like never before. Much of the technology and expertise are readily available. It's a matter of choice.
When anybody could convince 13% of idiots to go vote for you, you can win. That's the most disappointing part of the American public, is that one of the few rights you got left is to go vote, and a lot of people just don't take the time and don't care. And look where we at,
We must summon the willpower to force government, corporations, and Wall Street to become responsible for their actions before we reach the point of no return.
The future is up for grabs, you might say. It really is up for grabs, and we got to do something about it. And the only people that are going to do something about it, you just mentioned, are the people that care. And that's most people. That's most people. Most people care about their country. Most people care about this. The dissidents and the radicals get the exposure from that press you were talking about a while ago. You have a peace rally in one corner and you have a war rally in the other. Who gets the coverage? The peace rally is not going to get the coverage. The war rally is going to get the coverage. That's what people are going to watch. That's what the news are going to sell the newspapers. So we've got some changing to do, young people.
I was just talking to my daughter yesterday. I got on a long harangue about all kinds of things, hoping that they did a better job than we do. I'm hoping that our children learn a better balance with the environment, with the economy, with the things you need out of the environment. That there just needs to be a better stewardship.
Native elders say that, you know, I mean, if you listen to them, you know, they talk about the end time prophecies and all this kind of stuff, and they're like, oh, everybody's saying it's the end of the world, it's the end of the world, and this native elder says, the world's not going to end. Humans may end, but the world will still be here, you know, and there's an old Chippewa prophecy from Sun Bear back in the 20s. He said there will come a day when the earth will shake herself to rid herself of pesky humans like a dog shakes itself to rid itself of fleas. You know, and you got to look at the things that are happening. I mean, there's stuff happening all around the world every day.
There's beat something up enough, it doesn't get up again, right? You can exceed some threshold, and that's what we always are concerned about with ecological resilience is where is that threshold of impact where the system does not bounce back? We've seen this before. One of the best examples is Georges Bank, the cod fishery, one of the most tremendous fisheries on the face of the earth. And we fished it darn near to wiping it out. And there's still cod out there. We've backed off the fishing pressure, but those populations aren't growing. All right? We've exceeded some resilience threshold. They're not responding. There's no resilience there in the cod populations. There's something that we've done by going too far, too much of an impact. Have we done that to the Gulf of Mexico, to even one part of it, or all of it, or, you know, have we exceeded thresholds for the Gulf of Mexico ecosystem? We won't know for years.
It means that this generation that we pride ourselves in being such progressives, that we've changed so much stuff, the baby boomers. It means that everything we told them, they have to ignore. It means that all these promises we made about how right we were, we have to admit we were wrong. Did we change some great things? Sure. You know, I'd love to say we brought about civil rights to some degree. We did. We helped. I'd love to say that we gave women rights that they didn't have before today. Yeah, I'd like to say that. We had a positive social impact. But if you weigh the bad decisions we made along the way, if you weigh the consumerism that ate us up, if you weigh the culture that we built that is around celebrity, it's around ideas that don't really advance us as a culture, they entertain us. And we're able to say, we're able to say we've made some advances, I suppose, as a culture, entertaining ourselves, making ourselves comfortable, building our houses, making our cars. We've done some good things, I suppose, but I have to tell my child to ignore most of the things I've done. Because if she doesn't ignore the things we've made as a baby boomer generation, it's in game time.
They can burn in hell, the way I feel about them right now. That's the way I feel about it. They can burn in hell what they're doing to me now. You know, hey, I'm fed up with it, you know. They can burn in hell.